I want to give you a snapshot of 1860, the year before the Civil War begins, right? 1860. What does the free population of the South look like? The free South population in 1860. I can give you a couple of quick statistics and then I'll get your impression and ask you a question about this. See what you think. Basically, what I'm going to do is lay out the group and then kind of the characteristics of the group I'm talking about and then how many fit into that group. So we'll do a quick kind of population survey of the South, just the South, free population of the South in 1860. So the first group I have in mind are a group called large planters. Large planters. What are the characteristics of this group? What constitutes a large planter in 1860? Close enough. What's the size and the characteristics of this group of large planters? Basically, a large planter owned 50 or more slaves. So you had to own 50 or more slaves to be considered a large planter. And you had to have a plantation larger than 1,000 acres. So if you had 1,000 acres, more than 50 slaves, you were a large planter. You were a large planter. Now this would make you among the wealthiest class in the entire country. This would make you the wealthiest of the wealthy. These were the folks, in part, that Northerners were afraid of, that they saw as the slave power, the slaveocracy. They thought they were so wealthy and powerful that their influence could take over the government. Right? So these are large planters, 50 plus slaves, 1,000 plus acres. Now, this would constitute less than 1% of white families in the South in 1860. Less than 1% would fit this category of large planters. Now, I know our idea of the antebellum, so the South is that there are all these huge plantations everywhere and that everyone had 1 million slaves. That's not the case. Remember, we talked about how hierarchical the society is. There are a few folks that have a whole lot. Pierce Butler, he has 700 slaves at one point in South Carolina. This is ridiculous wealth. Makes him among the wealthiest in the country. Most did not, as you will see by this chart that we're creating. So less than 1% of white families would fit this category. They owned 50 or more slaves. They had plantations larger than 1,000 acres, and this made them the largest, the wealthiest class in the country. What about the second category, planters? What makes a planter then? We know the large planter is what makes a planter. A planter owned between 20 and 49 slaves. I couldn't own 50 plus because that makes you a large planter. Right? And these are rough numbers, but you'll get the point here. So 20 to 49 slaves. They tended to have plantations about 100 acres. So about 20 to 49 slaves and 100 acres in their land holdings. In many ways, they could control kind of the bulk of Southern wealth and prestige, like social power, right? There would be a larger group than the large planters, even though they're not as wealthy as the large planters. I think about some of the politicians of the period that would fit this category, for instance. They also constitute a lot of the South's political leadership. But they were only about 3%. Only about 3% of white families would fit this category in the South. Okay? 1% large planters, 3% planters. Third category, small slaveholders. Small slaveholders. What is a small slaveholder? Well, we know a small slaveholder is going to have less than a planter or a large planter, but they are still going to be slaveholders. They owned less than 20 slaves. So less than 20, but most of them owned less than 5 slaves. Should have had one of you write this for me. That would have been much neater. Maybe somebody that could draw straight lines. There we go. So a small slaveholder, you had to own less than 20 to fit this category, but most people in this category own less than 5. You might own 2 or 3 slaves. Right? That would make you fit into this category of small slaveholders. Some of them are part of a small middle class, like in towns and cities. So you might have a slave that takes care of the horses, for instance, in a town, or works in your shop, that kind of thing. They constituted 20%, about 20% of white families. Small slaveholders constituted about 20% of white families. Now this leads us to the next category. Number 4 are non-slaveholders. Non-slaveholders. I'm going to ask you about this group in a second. Non-slaveholders in the South. What did this category look like? Well, they were mostly yeoman farmers, right? Independent farmers. Often, though, they were kind of poor or subsistence farmers, maybe even squatters. Maybe they didn't even have their own land. This group often found themselves working for the other groups. So you might go next door to one of the slaveholders and say, hey, look, can I pick some tobacco on your list? And you just pay them something. Right? So they could be yeoman farmers or independent farmers, but they're often poor or subsistence squatters. Some of them are day laborers. They might find themselves working right next to slaves, picking cotton. But obviously there's a difference, right? They get to go home when they're done. Non-slaveholders constituted about 75% of white families in the South. 75% of white families in the South did not own slaves in 1860. But wait a second. How then, this is kind of the question I want you to see if you can come up with some possible answers for. We know that these folks are going to bear the brunt of the Civil War, right? As working people and poor people often do, right? You bear the brunt of the conflict. Why? Why do you think they would go to war, especially if the war is going to be about ending slavery? Why do you think it would be about this? Think about our concept of imagined community, for instance, or some other reasons why you think they might be willing to risk their lives, literally give their lives for something that doesn't seem to benefit them. Right? You had your hand up.
Oh, I was going to say that even when they weren't slaveholders, racism still was rampant throughout the South. So you could argue that even though they weren't slaveholders themselves, they couldn't bear the idea of like having free blacks just because they're racist.
Wow. Racism that powerful? You willing to die for it? I said, yep. This is a powerful idea. Someone argued. That's interesting. I'll put that one up as a possible explanation.
Going back to the idea of imagined communities, they almost felt like this attack on like their neighbors or their boss was more of an attack on them.
Okay. Yeah, think of this notion of imagined community. We talked about neighborhood, right, or an attack on a family. For instance, you feel like everyone is attacked, right? The September 11th, right? We think, even though those attacks happened far away from where we're standing, you didn't feel any less attacked in that instance, right? This notion of belonging to a community, if you feel like that community is under attack, whatever community it is, you're going to feel connected to that. So some will argue that we could use this concept to understand this, because it doesn't seem to be in their economic interest. At least doesn't seem to be. Some economists might argue there's some economic factors perhaps at play as well, but it wouldn't seem to be in their economic interest. Other reasons you think folks might be willing to do to fight in a civil war if you're a non-slaveholder? Would you fight if you're a non-slaveholder? I hate to make y'all slaveholders, but we can do it temporarily. And these folks don't own slaves. It's okay. It's okay. If you were a non-slaveholder in the South in 1860, would you have gone to war? Do you think?
I assume another possible explanation, but like at that point your life is kind of reliant on these people succeeding, and knowing that they will go down could easily mean that your family could end up starving as well.
Okay. So if the entire region is destroyed, then you're a part of that, or if this it's interesting because some might think taking the wealthy down a few pegs would help those that aren't wealthy, right? But they might go the other direction.
Easily backfire depending on how reliant the community is
Okay.
on these slaveholders.
Good point. Okay. Good. I just shared one of them.
that they're basically like they're seeing it as like if they're gonna fight to take down my employer.
Mm.
I'm
So
gonna
my job,
fight
where is my job is going. Good point. I'm tied with them even if we don't have the same economic interests we may have, some other ties.
The lifestyle was completely different than north than the south. It was urbanism was way bigger in the north, so
Okay.
you had like factories, bigger cities, and in the south, it was just like you had your little farm and you would grow enough food for yourself and your family, so you could, even though you're poor, you could survive in the south, but
Okay.
you wouldn't be able to survive in a city.
Good. So even this sort of idea of like different cultures, right? The idea that Yankees coming in are invaders of a different culture, even though they're all Americans. Remember this. These sections are seeing themselves as distinct and as different, culturally, socially, politically, economically, all of the things that you mentioned.
I remember that I forgot who it was that told that I remember reading in a book that like a lot of the people in the South thought it was going to be an easy win because they had most of the veterans.
Yeah, sort of culturally traditions of hunting and fishing and farming and defense and stuff. Southerners prided themselves on that. They thought those Yankees were going to come north and be a quick whipping and then be done with them. Right? They don't have the stomach to fight in this kind of case. And the South does do well early on. Right? They're doing quite well early on in the Civil War. That no longer drags out because of the industry and factories and such. It's going to be very difficult for the South to win. But initially, they are doing quite well. Any other thoughts about why? This is an ongoing question. I'm not saying there's one right answer to it. It's more about what I think the thought. I always think about the American dream. I always think about the American dream in this. Think about how this American dream is a powerful idea. Right? It motivates us in many ways. And there are at least two components to it again. Number one, hard work pays off. If you're willing to work hard, you expect to benefit eventually. It may not happen in one day. It may take your whole life, right? But you can work your way up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So even if this group is the poorest of the poor, and many of them are, I would say, almost as poor as slaves, right? The only difference between them might be their freedom and their skin color. They may even be homeless, right? Squatters, literally. But they're like, you know what? Tomorrow's going to be better. Right? Tomorrow will be a little bit better. Wait till my paycheck comes. Right? Wait till my ship comes in. That's part of the American dream, or the generational part. Man, if I just keep plugging along, my child will have a leg up. Right? My child will be a little bit better. I may never own a home, but my child will. Right? I may never get beyond an 8th grade education, but I want them to graduate high school. I want their kid to graduate college or go to grad school. Right? So this notion of the American dream can fuel, I think, can propel, especially those that might seem to have very little hope. It's always done that. So this might be a possibility as well. I don't own slaves now, but eventually that may happen.
Yeah, like because most of the non-slave owners are that because they didn't want to have slaves. It's just that they couldn't afford them, and they still believed in the slavery system.
Mm.
Having
Point.
racial slavery system, they believe in it. So God-given rights,
point.
pretty much.
Yeah,
That's
you
what they
take
believe.
away that right. That's true. Even though don't have it now.
Fight for that, yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Manifesto.
and it's kind of a mix of, the first point too, this notion of sort of racism and white supremacy was really central to the understanding of slavery. Even if I don't have one now, I should have the right to have one eventually, right? Some might think that's their only way out.
Because the biggest thing in a lot of Americans' thoughts of their right as freedom was their right to property, right?
Mm-hmm.
So attacking for slaves from like the north that they're doing is because they're attacking their property. So they're like, they have the property now and they're attacking that. What about us? When we have property, they're gonna come for us too. So they always like,
If you don't
they
defend that right
yeah.
now for them,
Uh-huh.
it will be defended for us, right? Good points. I really wanted to put this up because I wanted you to think about some of the complications and maybe the multiple reasons why folks might choose to fight. Maybe for many it was a defense of tradition, a defense of their homeland, their neighborhood, their region. Right? We hear a lot of those types of arguments, come out. Maybe for some it was simply racism. For some it might have been a mixture of racism and economic cooperation. What if I'm a non-slave holder and I'm working next to a slave, but at the end of the day I'm like, well, see, I'm out of here, right? What if now they're free? Suddenly there are 4 million freed slaves that I have to compete with. that's economically an issue too, and a race issue perhaps. Like, well, I don't like them because racially, or I don't like them because they're economic competition. Ever heard the phrase "they're taking our jobs"? Think about how those white Southerners might have been thinking that, right? Who's better at picking cotton than somebody been doing their whole life? So there might have been a lot of reasons, and I think we can use a concept like imagined community to try to wrap our minds around it. But it's complicated. It's complicated. Okay, I'm gonna push this a little bit forward. I'm gonna give you a break, and we'll end with a piece of business that I think you'll enjoy. Again, this period of the 1850s, we're spending some time here because it is so important. This idea of the social stratification in the South is part of what I wanted to use this chart to lay out, right? Because it doesn't make sense statistically, you could argue, but not everything is about statistics. Not everything is about statistics. I think we have some of the tools conceptually to try to make some sense of these ideas that may not seem to make mathematical sense. But they might make perfect sense when we use the concepts we have in front of us. By this period, of course, racism, biological determinism is a very powerful idea. Most people, I'm going to say everybody's racist, but people thought in terms of race. People thought not in the way that we're supposed to think now, that race is socially constructed. They thought race is strictly biological. You could look at someone and understand them. You could put them in a certain category as either being inferior or superior, all of that, right? And so this was how they understood the world. There was a whole pseudoscience of race that was established. You had scientists running around measuring people's skulls, right? Oh, yeah, their skull is 8 inches. That means you're obviously this and that. Like, now, I know some real smart guys with real tiny heads. You see this? I've had some professors with real tiny heads. Like, where do you put all that brain? Now, I have some friends, too, with some enormous craniums, and they might be dumb as rocks. Now, we know that it's not directly connected to that, right? Dinosaurs got real big heads. They weren't the smartest tools in the shed. So we've learned some things moving forward, but this was how folks thought at the time. Think about these issues of the minstrel shows in the 1840s. Yes, it's popular culture, but a lot of that was about intellectual inferiority or notions of intellectual inferiority, right? Especially among these happy, childlike slaves. Right? Ideology of race were very significant, and they applied not only just to African Americans, but to immigrants as well. These immigrants coming over are often painted in with that same brush. Think about the Irish, right? The Irish in particular will be stereotyped in very similar ways to what you saw in the ethnic notions. That they were supposedly lazy and drunk and violent and had to be forced to work and these sorts of things. In fact, we know and talked last time how this anti-immigrant sentiment will lead to a nativist movement. Remember this idea that you have a preference for those born in the U.S. As opposed to immigrants. In fact, this anti-immigrant sentiment would lead to a political party. The political party was known as the Know Nothings, or the American Party. Right? In 1853, the American Party would be formed. The American Party, or Know Nothings. Now, what's interesting is this Know Nothing Party will also oppose the extension of slavery. Wait a second, how do you look down on immigrants because you have these racial ideas, but you also oppose the extension of slavery? Well, they viewed the extension of slavery as a threat to free white workers. So they want to limit slavery from expanding into this free territory because that's going to hurt free white workers. The same reason they were against more immigrants coming in, that's going to hurt free white workers. So they would form a political party around these ideas that may not seem to make sense when you really think through them. They make a certain kind of sense. I'm going to say they make sense, but they have a certain logic to them, from the perspective of those that believe them. Let's put it that way. As we know that there are always free blacks as well in the society, and free blacks always served as a contradiction, right? A contradiction. Think about the images you saw in the video and how it said, for the most part, that slaves have to be slaves. Why? Because they can't take care of themselves. If they were free, they'd all die out. They're like children, right? You have to take care of children. It's almost cruel not to, right? You can't just abandon children. It'd be like doing the same thing to these slaves. The argument was if you freed all the slaves, they would die out because they can't take care of themselves. They won't work. They won't take care of their families. Now, free blacks were doing exactly that, though. Right? By the time the Civil War comes in 1860, there are 500,000 free blacks that had already been freed that were working and taking care of families and educating themselves and these sorts of things. So you could argue that free blacks always served as a contradiction to this entire racialized system. These free blacks will always have limitations on their freedom, even in the North. Right? There's hostility towards them, even in the North. They're most often denied most citizenship rights. Right? The right to vote was denied throughout the South for them, and permitted only in Massachusetts and New York temporarily. Educating them was often looked down upon. There was a lady named Prudence Crandall. Prudence Crandall was a woman in Connecticut, a white woman in Connecticut, who decided that she wanted to educate who she saw as the most vulnerable segment of the population. She decides to educate black girls. She builds a school and educates black girls. And she would receive threats. At one point, there's a story about the townspeople hooking up her schoolhouse. Like, imagine a room like this. They attach it to a team of horses and pull it into the river to kind of show her that they were not happy with her deciding to educate free black girls. And this is in the North, right? This isn't Mississippi. This is in Connecticut. So when we think about, like you said, this notion that race and racism are powerful ideas, even in the North in this period, that is true. Right? That is true. At the same time, we see that these politics are coming to a head. So some of these ideas we've already sort of touched on. We can move through them quickly. I want to give you a couple of quick examples of the sectional crisis that maybe is leading us to war. Even before the 1850s, around the Mexican War, you saw some of this sectionalism coming into play. One example is going to be something called a Wilmot Proviso or Proviso. I forget how to pronounce it. But basically what it was this. There was a Pennsylvania congressman by the name of David Wilmot. David Wilmot. In 1846, as we're preparing for war with Mexico, David Wilmot, a Pennsylvania Democrat, will introduce legislation in Congress that we should prohibit slavery in any territory we get from the war. So he's like, look, before we win this war, because we felt like we were going to win, right? Manifest destiny, right? Before we win this war and get a bunch of land, let's make a rule that slavery should not exist in any of the land. Bless you. He will try to introduce this in Congress, and it does not pass, but it freaks out pro-slavery forces. They're like, look, these Northerners are trying to limit slavery, right? They're trying to take away our right to expand. So even though it didn't pass, it's going to cause increased sectionalism, increased tension as of 1846. You're going to see these divisions. Even in presidential elections, right? In 1848, the presidential election of 1848, we're going to see these ideas come to a head. The Democrats in 1848 will nominate a guy named Lewis Cass for president. Lewis Cass, C-A-S-S. Now, none of us probably know that name, so you know he didn't win. Right? But he does get nominated. He was a Michigan senator. He argues for something called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. Now, we've seen that term sovereignty before. We saw it on the first day. Remember, it comes up in Benedict Anderson's article. Nations like to be sovereign. They like to make their own decisions. They don't like others to tell them what to do. They want to decide for themselves. So what do we think popular sovereignty means? The people should decide. People should vote on whether they want slavery or not. That's how we'll resolve these issues moving forward. Popular sovereignty. From Lewis Cass's perspective, and this makes perfect sense, this is the way to solve the conflict between North and South. Let's just let the people decide. So every time a state comes up for statehood, we'll just let the people decide whether they want it to be a slave state or a free state. It's a democratic way, right? Just vote on it. So he proposes this term popular sovereignty, the idea that people within each territory should decide whether or not to permit slavery. Now, the Whig Party that had emerged during Jacksonian period will nominate a hero from the Mexican-American War by the name of Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is going to be a war hero, but Zachary Taylor was also a Southerner from Louisiana. So everything by this point, you can argue, is being read in terms of North and South, being read in terms of slave, pro-slave, anti-slave opinion. So you got Lewis Cass on one hand, Michigan. You got Zachary Taylor on the other hand from Louisiana, who happened to be a large plantation owner, even though he kind of would like to distance himself from that. His nomination disturbs his own party so much that abolitionists within the Whig Party leave. They will leave the party. They will call themselves conscience Whigs, or Whigs of conscience. They decide that they can no longer stay in this particular political party. They will leave the party and they will form a new party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party. What does free soil mean? You shouldn't have slavery there. The Free Soil Party. They will nominate their own candidate for president. Right? They will nominate their own candidate by the name of Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was a New Yorker. Right? He had succeeded Andrew Jackson as president in 1837. So they nominate a former president as a third-party candidate. A third-party candidate. Now, this third-party candidacy will split the Democratic vote, and Taylor will get elected president. So think about how the politics of slavery are already impacting national politics in terms of this election. Some consider that this issue shows already that slavery had become a central issue to the politics, and also that this free soil politics are gaining strength, gaining momentum, gaining speed. So all of this stuff is happening against this backdrop that we've already sort of laid out. So Zachary Taylor is in office, right, during the intense debate about the status of slavery in the Mexican cession, the territory that we get from Mexico. Remember, after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, gold is discovered here in California, right, leading to a massive influx of people, which means that California comes up for statehood pretty quickly, right, because its population will reach the threshold. We applied for statehood in 1850 as a free state. Now, again, California's white majority does not necessarily, it's not necessarily super moral. Some argue it's more about economics for us, not wanting slaves to come in, especially with the discovery of gold. So we will apply for admission as a free state. But at the time, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states. Remember that delicate balance, right? What's going to tip, or this threatens to tip the delicate balance. And both sides are nervous about this possible shift. So at the time, there were 15 free states and 15 slave states, meaning equal representation in the Senate. But actually, the North already enjoyed a 61-vote majority in the House because of population. So we already had a slight majority in the House, but it was equal in the Senate. And so Southerners are like, man, this is going to tip the balance even further in favor of the North. Now, Zachary Taylor himself is a Southerner, so some expect him to support the slave power in this. Now, Taylor will come out in favor of the principle of popular sovereignty. The people will decide. At least in Utah and New Mexico, those territories that are coming up. Especially since those people were likely to vote against slavery, since it's above the line. But how are we going to figure this out? How are we going to work this out? Southerners will resist California's admission. So once again, there's a deadlock and a compromise will have to be worked out. Henry Clay, one of the architects of the Compromise of 1820, will propose a solution. It will be the Compromise of 1850 that we discussed. Admit California as a free state and allow popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. In response, the South will get a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, as we discussed. So they feel like they got something, Northerners feel like they got something that's compromised, right? Everybody wins. But ultimately, no one's going to be happy. Right? No one's going to be happy with this compromise. In fact, Southerners feel like they've given up the entire American West. Right? Northerners feel like they've given up this much stronger Fugitive Slave Act, which allows slaveholders to come into the heart of the North and kidnap people back to slavery. Literally snatch people off the street, which begins to happen. Right? So both sides are very upset about this. Abolitionists will redouble their efforts. In fact, you see more activities among what's called the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is not an actual train. Right? It was about a series of safe houses, right? A network of safe houses that would help slaves run away, get to the North, and to free territory. Now, after 1850, some abolitionists believe that slaves are not even safe in the North, that they have to go all the way to Canada to avoid being recaptured in slavery. Why? Because of this Fugitive Slave Act. This is, again, when Harry Beecher Stowe begins writing Uncle Tom's Cabin in protest to the Fugitive Slave Act. So, again, people are not happy on either side, and things seem to be increasing dramatically, right? We're into this decade of the 1850s where things are going to come to a head. Uncle Tom's Cabin, we already mentioned, sells 3 million copies. Southerners are offended by how they were portrayed in that text. More territories are coming up for statehood, in particular Kansas and Nebraska. Right? The Kansas and Nebraska territories are looking like they're ready. Some argue that this issue of popular sovereignty can solve the problem and maybe save the Union. Right? The next test will be Kansas and Nebraska. Right? These territories had been unorganized and thought to be uninhabitable for a while, but by the 1840s, settlers had moved in and started organizing it into territories, right? The Kansas and Nebraska territories. Now, technically, because Kansas and Nebraska territories were north of the Missouri Compromise line, remember that line in 1820 that essentially divides the nation in half and says everything north of that is supposed to be free. But now we have popular sovereignty. So what if a territory that's in the north votes through popular sovereignty to have slavery? Are you going to have slavery or are you not? So this is an issue, right? This is an issue. What happens is, as Kansas in particular gets ready to vote, right, to take a referendum, you have thousands of settlers flocking into the territory. Why? Well, you have thousands of abolitionists flocking in so that they can vote Kansas to be free. You have thousands of pro-slavery forces flocking in. They hope to vote Kansas to be a slave state. In fact, they formed two separate governments in two separate cities in Kansas. Some people feel like this is actually the beginning of the Civil War. You're going to have violence in Kansas, and this is why it's referred to by 1856 as Bleeding Kansas. You have people die, including John Brown, an abolitionist who kills several pro-slavery men in Kansas. So by 1856, you can argue people are already dying around the issue of slavery and expansion. A coalition of free soilers and abolitionists. What's the difference between a free soiler and an abolitionist? An abolitionist wants to end slavery, right, everywhere. A free soiler just doesn't want slavery to spread. Right? So you get a coalition of free soilers and abolitionists that are against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They are going to form a new political party. This new political party will be known as the Republican Party. The Republican Party. So this is the Republican Party that's going to be founded here in the 1850s. They're joined by members of the American or Know Nothing Party. Remember the Know Nothings, the anti-immigrant party, who opposed slavery in the territories for the same reason they opposed immigration. Right? They don't want it to threaten native-born white workers. These Republicans will nominate their first candidate, a guy from California by the name of John C. Fremont. They nominate Fremont for president in 1856. Fremont makes a respectable showing for a new party, but he does not win. He does not win. He will lose to the Democrat James Buchanan. But already by 1856, some argue that these presidential elections have become kind of a referendum on slavery. But you are seeing a growing strength for this young Republican Party. So Buchanan wins the presidency, and he's going to walk into a firestorm. Right? He walks into a firestorm in 1857. He had hoped to avoid the whole issue of slavery. Right? He had hoped to kind of push this off on some other areas of government. In particular, he hopes the Supreme Court will deal with the issue of slavery so that he as president does not have to. And this is exactly what he's going to engineer. A case called the Dred Scott case. The Dred Scott case. What basically happened is this. Dred Scott was a slave. Dred Scott was a slave, and he had been taken from Missouri, which had slavery, to the north. I think it's the Wisconsin Territory. His owner takes him there, and he lives there for maybe a few years. Now, he will argue that if he was a slave in Missouri, but now he lives in free territory, he is no longer a slave. Why? Because there is no slavery in that territory. So he's going to sue. He's going to sue. His case will work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's about to be thrown out of the Supreme Court, but President Buchanan says, no, I don't want to deal with that. You guys resolve it. Right? So he asked the Supreme Court to deal with the issue. And the Supreme Court does deal with the issue, and this is what they say. In Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, Supreme Court Justice Roger Taney rules against Dred Scott and his wife. He argued that as African Americans, whether slave or free, they could not possibly be citizens of the United States because the founding fathers had not ever intended for them to be citizens of the United States. Therefore, he argued they had no right to even sue in federal court. They shouldn't be allowed to even appear in front of him. Chief Justice Roger Taney wrote that no African American, slave or free, could ever be considered citizens. He argued further that back in 1820, Congress had no authority under the Constitution to prohibit slavery in the Wisconsin Territory or to prohibit slavery in any territory in the U.S. So some pro-slavery forces are like, man, he's saying we can have slavery in every state. Taney ruled that the Missouri Compromise itself had been unconstitutional. Slave owners were now fully protected if they chose to bring their slaves into Western territories or even into the North. Now, this will outrage abolitionists, right? This outrages abolitionists. Many are convinced that the time had come for radical action, even violence, if necessary. And John Brown, who we just saw in Kansas, is going to be one of the ones we point to. John Brown was from Connecticut. He was a white abolitionist that was incredibly radical. Some thought he was crazy because he said he talked to God. John Brown said that God told him that he was born to break the jawbone of slaveholders. He comes up with a plan. John Brown comes up with a plan. His plan was this. I'm going to attack Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where they keep all the guns, federal arsenal. He's going to take those guns, distribute them to the slaves of Virginia, and essentially start the biggest slave revolt in history. And that will end slavery. That was his plan. And he starts off doing exactly that. He attacks Harper's Ferry, but he's going to get pinned down by a young military official by the name of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee will later lead the Confederate forces in the Civil War. This time he wasn't a general yet. But John Brown will get captured and executed. Captured and executed. But think about pro-slavery forces. They're like, oh my goodness. Not only are slaves revolting, but we have white abolitionists from the North attacking us. That's how they figured the Civil War has already started in 1859. The very next year, of course, the election of the Republican, Abraham Lincoln, will be the final straw to many. Lincoln had distinguished himself 2 years earlier running for Senate, but now in winning for the Republican Party, many saw this as the abolitionists themselves winning the election. Now, while Lincoln did argue that the nation could not survive, quote-unquote, half slave and half free, he had always said that he was not planning to touch slavery where it existed. He just didn't want it to expand. But Southerners looked at his victory as the North winning. And you can understand why. Lincoln's only going to get 39% of the popular vote. Lincoln does not even campaign in the South. He didn't appear on the ballot in most Southern states. This is how divided the country was. He wasn't even on the ballot. So Southerners are like, how'd this guy win that wasn't even on our ballot? How'd this guy win with 39% of the popular vote? So many will argue that this is kind of the beginning of the end. Right? This is the beginning of the end. When Lincoln is elected, the South, of course, is quite upset. He will become the 16th president, but his election signals to the Deep South that they had lost this long kind of balance of power game. Lincoln does not attack the South. Right? South Carolina will formally secede from the Union December 20th, 1860. Even before Lincoln is inaugurated, right, they leave the Union. Other states, of course, will join them. Lincoln wants to be patient. He does not attack when they left the Union. In fact, it's going to be the South that attacks first. Right? They will attack Fort Sumter, which was a federal arsenal in South Carolina, and they'll force it to surrender after bombing it. That's when the Civil War begins. Right? That's when the Civil War begins. April 12th, 1861, barely a month after Lincoln takes office. Okay, I know that was quite a lot.